عليكم and welcome back to Pure Pathways. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي بسم الله. So the last time we were together, we described how the Quran, which came down slowly over a 23-year period, was then collected and compiled into one book. And since then, scholars have pondered over the amazing qualities of this book, which hasn't changed in over 1400 years. Now, the Quran is miraculous in so many different ways. But you're probably wondering, why do I need to know this? I'm already Muslim, so what difference does it really make? Well, I'm going to ask you, are you Muslim just because your parents are Muslim? Or are you Muslim because you're convinced that Islam is the right religion? And how can you be convinced that Islam is the right religion if you're not convinced that the Quran is the true word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Now, when the prophets of the past saw miracles with their own eyes, it did something to their hearts. There was a point when Ibrahim alayhi salam asked Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to see him bring life from death. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala asked him, well, don't you believe? But our prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam replied, yes, but to give my heart ease. And he's a prophet. So yeah, you and I, we've already received the Quran's message. We know what's right, we know what's wrong, what we should and shouldn't do. But if we don't think about the Quran as a miracle, if we don't think about it, ask questions about it, ponder over it, then how will we satisfy our hearts? So let's do some thinking today and let's ask ourselves some questions about the Quran. I'm sure you've all heard your imam, your teachers, your parents, all these people around you telling you that the Quran is a miracle, that the Quran is so amazing. But let's admit that sometimes you think to yourself, what's so amazing about it? How exactly is it a miracle again? Because when we think of miracles, usually we think of these extraordinary events, something magical, like something that we see in the movies, things that we hear about in fairy tales. When we think about miracles, we think about Prophet Musa alayhi salam when he split the sea with his staff, or Prophet Salih alayhi salam when he brought a live camel from the rocks of a mountain, or Prophet Isa alayhi salam when he brought the dead back to life. Those are all miracles that were performed by the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. There's no doubt about it. And each group had their own distinct miracle that was different from those of other people. So, did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala choose the types of miracles randomly? Not at all. Each miracle is specific to its people. The miracle was something that those people could relate to based on their time and the situation of their community. For example, Musa alayhi salam's people were great magicians and they were masters at creating tricks using optical illusions. So one of the miracles that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent to Musa alayhi salam was for his staff to turn into a snake before their very eyes and destroy all their fake snakes. Salih alayhi salam's people were skilled at carving amazing homes into the mountains. So their miracle was for a real life pregnant camel to emerge from that very rock that they carved their homes from. Isa alayhi salam's people were the most medically advanced of their time. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent Isa alayhi salam with the miracle of curing the blind and the leper and bringing the dead back to life. Every prophet received a miracle that related to the people and the skills that those people had. So with that being said, what does this have to do with the Quran? Well, since every miracle matched the skill of the people to whom it was sent, let me ask you, what were Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam's people good at? What were they known for? They were known for the art of poetry, spoken rhyme. Quraysh perfected the Arabic language. They were masters of Arabic. They held poetry competitions among the tribes yearly next to the Kaaba. So the miracle that came to them had to be one that they could appreciate, that would dumbfound them. So when the Quran came down and they heard it, they knew that it was not like their poetry. Those could not possibly be words of a human being. In the Quran, we'll see that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala challenged them and challenged anyone to bring a surah or even an ayah like that of the Quran. And even though Quraysh took pride in being the most eloquent Arabs in the world, they could not even come close. So let's backtrack a little bit. All the previous miracles that came down to the prophets, Ibrahim alayhi salam, Salih, Musa, Dawood, Sulaiman, Isa alayhim salam, you believe that those miracles happened. But they'll never affect you the same way that they affected the people who saw those miracles with their own eyes. Those miracles happened, but they're gone now. And only a few people saw them. And now they're stories from the past. Were you in Egypt when Musa alayhi salam's staff turned into a snake? Did you see Ibrahim alayhi salam walking out of the fire untouched? Sulaiman talking to the animals, or Dawood using the wind to fly? No, those are just stories of the past now. The miracles of the prophets of the past were miracles for the eyes. But the miracle of the Quran, the miracle of Muhammad ﷺ, is a miracle for the ears, for the heart, and for the mind. The miracles of the prophets of the past were one-time miracles that came and went. But the Quran is here to stay until the end of time. And it, unlike all the other miracles, is a miracle that can be experienced by anyone, at any time, in any location on earth. Today, isn't it possible for you and I to hear the Quran, to recite it, to learn it? Do we have to live in the Arabian Peninsula? No. Did we have to be alive during the time of Muhammad ﷺ? No. And this is why on the Day of Judgment, Muhammad ﷺ's ummah will be larger than the ummah of any other prophet before him. Because his message has no time limit and no constraints. So now, how do I know that this book is legit? That it wasn't written by someone? Well, unlike the words of humans, the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can have no mistakes and no contradictions. It has to be perfect. If we just take the time to look, there are miracles in the Quran that prove to you and I that it was not written by any man. So the book itself proves its own legitimacy. So today we'll be discussing the miracle of the Quran's preservation, the linguistic and grammatical miracles within it, the scientific statements within it, and its rhythm and the ability for it to be memorized. So let's start with the miracle of the Quran's preservation. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala promised us that He has sent down the reminder to us and that He will protect it. Well, history has proven that the Quran has the same words, the same letters, the same harakat that were spoken directly to the Prophet over 1400 years ago. And there's no religious group out there that can say the same thing about their book. For example, there are so many different versions of Bibles in the world. One Bible will have verses and chapters that another doesn't. Some will have words that appear in older versions but not in the newer versions. If you look at Buddhists and Hindus, for example, they have many holy books, but nobody can say for sure who wrote them. The Quran is the only book where its language is still spoken today. The Hindu books were originally written in Sanskrit, which is now a dead language. The books of the Jews and the Christians were originally written in ancient Greek, Aramaic, and Hebrew, but those languages are no longer spoken in the same way as they are today. The Buddhist books were written in many different languages without a known source connecting them to an original document. But Arabic, the language of the Quran, is still alive and spoken today by millions of Muslims around the world. And I'm not talking about the slang Arabic. I'm talking about the pure Fusha Arabic. So in summary, we are the only religion that has an original book in the original language that is still spoken today. So now let me ask you this. Why did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala choose Arabic? Well, we know that the Arabs were masters at poetry, and they would recognize the difference between the eloquent speech of man and the speech of God. But why were the Arabs the ones chosen to pass down the Quran? Well, we've said before that the Arabs had an oral tradition, and because they were mostly illiterate, they relied heavily on their memory. You and I, we rely so much on our phones that we don't even have anything memorized anymore. I don't even have my own children's phone numbers memorized. But the Arabs, having had no internet, no real books or paper, they relied on their memory. Their traditions were preserved and passed on orally from generation to generation. And this made the Arabs the perfect people to preserve the Quran. So what about the people who say that the Prophet ﷺ wrote the Quran himself? Well, other than the fact that the Prophet was known to be illiterate and one of the very few Arabs that were bad at poetry, if the Quran were written by a human, you would have seen contradictions or changes in writing style or viewpoint over the 23 years of its revelation. Remember, the Quran didn't come down all at once. So for example, if I wrote an essay today, and I wrote another one on that same topic 20 years from now, you would surely sense a difference in my writing style. You would even see a difference in the way that I think, because people grow and they change, and so their viewpoints change over time. If I said something today and it wasn't written down, how would I remember what I said 23 years later? I mean, I can't even repeat word for word what I said to you since the beginning of this episode. And that's because I'm a human being, I'm imperfect. But the Quran is the speech of God. It's the speech of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that's why it's perfect. It has no mistakes and it has no contradictions. So let's move on to linguistic miracles now. The way that the Quran uses grammar is studied by scholars to no end. There are so many hidden meanings and multiple meanings in the Quran that come to light with every generation. For example, it's a miracle how the Quran can use just a few words to say so much. Sometimes you need a few sentences to accurately translate an ayat that just has a few words. And even if we could translate those words of the Quran, we'll never be able to translate the miracle that comes with the true knowledge of Arabic. And that's why it's so important for all of us to learn Arabic, because it's the language of the Quran. There are other instances, for example, where there's more than one word that has similar meanings in the Quran, but not exactly the same meaning. We might think that they're synonyms, but they aren't. And we keep discovering the reasons behind why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala uses one word instead of another word in different contexts. Now, some of these grammatical issues might not be so amazing to you or I because our Arabic isn't that great. But for the Arabs of Quraysh, more than anyone else, they were amazed by the Quran because they were the experts in the Arabic vocabulary and grammar. The kuffar used to cover their ears when the Prophet ﷺ would recite Quran, because despite their arrogance, they couldn't help but feel its beauty when they heard the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It spoke to their hearts even though they tried to fight it because they wanted to keep with the traditions of their people. Even Quraysh's best poet, Al-Walid ibn al-Mughira, he admitted to his people that the words of the Quran were like nothing he had ever heard before. So even the people who hated the Quran were mesmerized by it, but they refused to accept it because of their pride. If the Arabs had not felt threatened by the Quran, then why would they avoid listening to its ayats? Why would they work so hard to stop the Prophet ﷺ's mission? Why would they offer him money and power and everything that they owned for him to stop? Why even bother? The simple answer is they were threatened because they knew that the Quran was the truth and that the people would eventually see that truth and believe in it. Have you ever seen those clips that they have on YouTube of Muslim men who go out into the streets and will randomly stop people in the street and ask them to listen to the ayat from the Quran? Of course, they don't tell them what they're listening to, they just ask them to listen. And then they'll ask them how they felt. And oftentimes the people will say, oh my God, like we have no idea what it's saying, but it just touches my heart. It just feels so good. I feel so peaceful. So subhanAllah, you cannot help but feel the psychological effects of the Quran when you hear it, even when you're not a Muslim and you don't understand it. And that's because it's the word of our Creator speaking to us. So let's move on now to the scientific miracles. There are so many books that are written on scientific miracles in the Quran. Now we know that the Quran is a book of guidance, but it also includes some medical and scientific information. The Quran mentions scientific facts centuries before their discovery. Facts about medicine, biology, astrology, geology, astronomy. This could only happen if the Quran was from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. For example, when the moon is mentioned in the Quran, the moon is called Munir, which means something that reflects light. But when the sun is mentioned in the Quran, it's called Siraj, which means a source of light, like a lamp. And now we know that the moon does not produce its own light. It actually gets its light from the sun. So it is a reflector. When the people would look at the moon back in the desert 1400 years ago, they had no way of knowing this. So if the Prophet ﷺ or anyone else had written the Quran themselves, how would they have known these facts before modern science discovered them? There are many other examples as well, such as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioning how fingerprints are unique to each individual, how honey has healing properties, how the female bee is the one who pollinates, how the leader of the ants is a female. There was no way for the Arabs at the time to know any of these facts. Also, the way that embryology is mentioned in the Quran is amazing. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes the way in which we are formed in the bellies of our mothers in such detail. And these things were mentioned in a time when the only way to know if a mom was having a boy or a girl was to wait for the baby to be born and look and see. Now, the last thing we're going to talk about is the ability for the Quran to be memorized. Muslims are the only religious group that memorizes their book from beginning to end. No other religious tradition memorizes their book in its entirety. And I'm not just saying a few Muslims here and there, or just the religious scholars, or only the professors of Islam. We're talking about normal, everyday Muslims. We're talking about little kids all over the world. Every community of Muslims has at least some individuals who are hafaz. And every one of you, I'm sure, knows at least one person who's a hafiz. And those people who don't know the entire Quran know at least a few surah. And we know that Arabs only make up like 20% of Muslims around the world. So a large portion of these Hafaz don't even speak Arabic. So if you really think about it, Hafaz, you and I, with every surah and every ayah that we memorize, we become walking, breathing examples that the Quran has been miraculously preserved. How can we leave this Quran and put it on our shelves to collect dust after knowing all of these amazing things about it? May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala help us to preserve His words in our hearts and to keep us connected to Him always. Next time, we'll wrap up our Journey of the Quran series with our final lesson. We'll be talking about the benefits of the Quran. How does the Quran solve our problems? What is its role as a guide throughout our life? And what are the benefits to us in this life and in the hereafter? So I hope to see you next time. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and send dua. And as always, may all your pathways be pure. Assalamu alaikum.